Hey everybody, Cody Shirk here. I am currently in Florida, but I just got back from Guyana. I've been visiting Guyana over the past several months, and every time I return back to the US, people always say, Cody, aren't you worried about getting stuck in the middle of a war? Isn't Venezuela going to invade Guyana? And I'm going to explain what's happening right now on the ground in Guyana, but also what this means for the world and why you should care about it, especially if you're an investor or on the ground there. So I'm not going to dive too deep into Venezuela or Guyana because they both have their own interesting stories and I could talk about each one for hours. What I'm going to talk about is the land, the western two-thirds of Guyana, the Essequibo region, which Venezuela is saying is theirs. Maduro has threatened to invade Guyana to take this land back. I'm using air quotes there because it hasn't belonged to Venezuela for over 150 years, and even back then it was disputed. But Maduro nonetheless is barking that he's going to initiate an invasion of Guyana. So first of all, this area of the world is very difficult for most people to understand if you haven't been there because it's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, but it is extremely diverse in nature. You have mountains, huge rivers, deserts, savanna land, swamp. It's very, very extreme land. It's right next to the Amazon area. And so the idea of launching a land invasion on this region is laughable. The US military couldn't even do it, or any other large military couldn't do it. On top of that, this region is extremely remote. So even if you invaded through this area that has no roads, that has no infrastructure, that has nothing, you've got to occupy it. And how do you occupy land if you can barely get through it, let alone sit there and exist? It's just not going to happen from a traditional land invasion standpoint. However, there are some untraditional ways that Venezuela could launch an invasion or at least cause problems about Guyana. I'll talk about that in just a second. The other big thing to consider is that ExxonMobil, which is a US company, the largest oil company out of the US, is operating in Guyana. And if Venezuela went to go invade Guyana, the US government would step in a second. We've seen this happen in multiple different countries around the world. We're seeing it happen right now in Syria, where the US has military bases set up to fight terrorism, but also protect ConocoPhillips, which is operating the gas fields in Syria. So as it pertains to Guyana, the idea that Venezuela would invade Guyana and jeopardize operations of ExxonMobil without the US military intervening is laughable. The untraditional part that I alluded to earlier has to do with an announcement that Venezuela made back in 2012 about how Venezuela has manufacturing and assembly facilities in Venezuela for Iranian drones. Originally, Venezuela had stated that those drones were used for surveillance along the Venezuelan and Colombian border, where the Colombians were fighting the Colombian guerrillas, FARC, and other cartel with the US government. The Venezuelans said, hey, we want this drone technology to understand what's happening next to our country, which, to be neutral, sounds kind of fair. But if you read between the lines, obviously Venezuela is using the technology from Tehran, from Moscow, and from China to develop weapons within Venezuela and import parts of weapons and parts of technology to assemble within Venezuela. This is pretty well documented. This is happening. Not only are there actual photos of drones, Iranian drones in Venezuela, but there are flights that have been going between Caracas, Moscow, and Tehran on a weekly basis for over a decade. In fact, Venezuela's own airline, Conviasa, has been using their passenger planes to transport military equipment for quite some time. So this drone technology and probably many other military technologies from China, from Russia, from Iran, likely exists in Venezuela. And Venezuela could definitely use this untraditional warfare to cause problems for Guyana. Now, I don't personally think that Venezuela would be doing any invasions of drones or other warfare on the people of Guyana or even really the government of Guyana. I think they'd be more targeting US operations in Guyana, which is the offshore oil derricks, which is the onshore oil processing and pipeline areas, and any other US operated asset within Guyana. That's not to say that it wouldn't affect Guyana. I would just say that if Venezuela was going to launch something against Guyana, it would probably relate to untraditional warfare targeting US assets within Guyana. So is this going to happen next week, next month? No, it's not going to happen really at all. This is a card for Maduro to put in his back pocket to hold just in case something in the world unfolds where he can whip that card out and play it. If something happens in the Middle East, if something happens with NATO and the US in Ukraine against Russia, if something happens in the South China Sea, Maduro is going to have an opportunity to play that card strategically as he wishes. Now, if you're an investor in ExxonMobil, should you be worrying about this? No, I would not be worrying about this really at all. It is worth noting that the investment environment in Venezuela over the past several years has been unbelievable. People don't know about this at all, but the Caracas Stock Exchange has seen unbelievable returns because, number one, people didn't think Maduro was going to stay in power, but number two, the US lifted some sanctions. So a lot of investors have made a ton of money in Venezuela. Now, as I speak today, the US recently seized Maduro's plane, his jet, that was in Dominican Republic for some service. So it's highly unlikely what's going to happen in the short term in terms of a tit-for-tat war between Venezuela and the US using sanctions, and I'm going to seize this and I'm going to take that. However, it's pretty clear that the division between the US and Venezuela, as well as Iran, Russia, and China, is only increasing. That division is becoming more and more. And there are no real efforts to mend these relationships. So this is worth keeping an eye on for people who are concerned about the direction our world is headed. And if you're an investor who has assets or money in any of these regions, it's something to think about and keep your eye on, because if relations continue to deteriorate, this card that Maduro has in his back pocket, that he can invade Guyana, I'm using air quotes there because it would probably be some sort of hybrid warfare terrorist type attack, he could certainly play that, and it would be more likely to affect ExxonMobil in the US and the oil flow rather than the people of Guyana. I hope none of this happens, obviously. I hope that Guyana continues to prosper as it has been over the past couple of years. Their GDP has more than tripled since 2019. I hope Guyana is able to use their oil resources to develop their nation in an ethical, moral way, and they are not affected by the resource curse, but we shall see. I will be going back down to the country a lot over the next year, and I'm going to be going in other areas, so I'll try and give you a broad view of what's going on and how you can understand the bigger picture here. All right, see you guys.